Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Cartographer Office Hours, March 7th. Let me share real quick a screen. Again, welcome, Mr. Scott Rosenberg. Thank you for attending. We're really glad to see you here. All right. For today's session, we are trying a different format. The goal of this space is basically right now to move RFCs, to discuss RFCs, and eventually be able to move them on the stages of the RFC process. So a pretty basic way to see what were the changes in this last meeting. What were the RFCs that were moved from different stages in the last meeting? I created this table. Yeah, I know it's nothing really sophisticated, but at least it's a way to have a clear sense of what happened last week and what can we do to move these RFCs. Okay, can we have a note taker who would like to take notes for today's session?
I can take notes.
Thank you, Emily. All right. Thank you, Rush, and everyone else. All right. Outstanding RFCs. Remember, and for anyone out there watching the recording, we have a project board in the GitHub repo where we where we can see, or that's the plan, to see the stages of the RFCs according to the process. Last week we had 3 RFCs moving to final comment period. So I wanted to start with this one, more options selector. According to the process, we already have approval by at least one member from the TOC, and I believe supermajority from the maintainers team. And also 7 days since the FTP stage started. So is there any objection to move this to accepted? Will that be the next stage?
Yes.
That is correct. Okay. So moving to accepted if there is no objection or option selector. Yeah, this one. All right, so that will mean it's pending implementation work, but right now it's accepted. All right, next one. Let me put this here. Accepted. Match fields and match labels. I'm not sure if this one is to be moved to accepted or completed because I saw a PR referencing that our RFC, so I'm not sure if it's already been implemented.
For expedience, we did actually have to start work on a lot of these things, but if you put it in accepted, we'll make sure they get moved to done
All right.
during our planning meeting.
Cool.
If anyone disagrees with that, I think that's the best way to deal with it here in this meeting.
Any objection to move it to accepted? Oh. All right. Great. And finally, the workload prefix RFC. I see that we have an approval from a TOC member and, well, 5 approvals from the maintainers team. This one says merge. So again, should we move to accepted because it's not completed yet? Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Let me put it here, accepted and accepted. There you go. Before we touch on the conventions one, I just wanted to mention a couple of RFCs blocked on technical oversight. I believe Marty also pointed out here the multi-pad RFC. specifically block on technical oversight. Is there any objection, any discussion topic that TOC members would like to bring in here?
I would like to bring up one thing. So this morning I was trying the PR. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, yeah, I thought Spike, you were trying a Spike. Is
I was
that
gonna.
correct?
Yes. So Beauty locally here was running it, and yeah, please folks give it a try. It's pretty cool. I was like, oh, what if I was about to create a supply chain that looks like this? It's essentially like one that goes from like source to image being viewed to deploying with a conditional on like if the workload specifies the image, then you don't need to like build it, right? And I don't know, like the experience was pretty nice. Like it was very simple to express that, and everything just worked. I had a little hiccup there. I didn't really properly read the RFC, but then yeah, Rash helped me out, and I don't know, the experience was really cool. Really liked it. So I do want to, yeah, let folks know it's good to try it out. It works. If you have any like problems building it locally, if it's like first time you're doing it, feel free to reach out. We can also help with that. At the end of the day, it should be like a KO resolve at the config directory, and that should give you the final YAML.
It's interesting, right? I saw where you got tripped up. I followed along the comments, and it's like you put the selector on a different part of the path, right? And that's so
yeah.
and it's like you put it on the equivalent block in the path, right? Instead of like the first block in the path. And it's like, in theory, we should be able to determine that, like, in theory, that should probably work too, right? Rash, maybe this is more a question for you.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I mean, at that point you've got a I mean, at that point, I can't remember what failed there, to be honest with you. Trying to remember why it failed. But at that point, you've got to select, you're saying, I'll pick this thing up after I've run something else that I should never have to run. So yes, it should work technically, but it's not the right choice, because you don't want the source path one to run at that point. You don't want the source to be picked up and put into a repo. That's where the selector belonged. It's just about knowing that the inputs are a thing that you can select on. And I think that's what Zero hadn't really picked up on at that point. But yeah, you still need that first step. So that's where it ought to be. It probably should have run, but I'm not sure what the bug was. I wasn't looking into it because he'd used it wrong. It's something we can investigate.
Interesting.
I think, David, to get back to your question about TOC votes on this, I think there's still concerns about the complexity it adds to the user experience. And if we could, implement something simpler sooner to work towards some of those use cases, as opposed to kind of turning the supply chain into something that's could be many graphs laid on top of each other. But those are kind of still things we're discussing. I don't want to speak for the other TOC folks though.
I'm curious where those discussions are happening, because I feel like the maintainer team, at least myself, hasn't been a part of a lot of those conversations with the technical oversight committee, at least not for a while. So I'm curious where those discussions are happening and how we can be more involved in that.
I think some of it is just ad hoc. Like I know I'm talking to Rash a little bit about, those ideas. I don't think there's been like an organized effort to, kind of talk through this aside from different Slack conversations happening in different places. Should we follow up with that, or?
It seems like it has a lot of approvals from the maintainer side, and it'd be good if like the maintainer side is approving and the technical oversight side is not. Maybe we should be trying to align and get on the same page to help unblock this. Or if it's not unblocking this RFC, then unblocking something else. Like it feels like there's some sort of misalignment going on that we're not really addressing.
Scott?
One area where I'm just trying to make sure I understand what's being proposed here is not just what the happy path looks like, but like how much potential accidental complexity is being introduced. Like, how easy are we making it for a user to make a mistake or to not understand what they're specifying? So not just like you can create something that's simple, but like it's also easy to understand that simple thing.
So, I mean, I totally appreciate that. I just don't understand how, like in looking at it, I review that from the perspective of people are going to try the workloads that are that should be applied. I would imagine they're going to come up with work. I think the same problem exists for this and snippets as a solution, because you're still going to end up with one selection or another through the path. I'm not sure how the incidental complexity changes much when you're actually describing the same set of resources and one possible path through them. So something to keep in mind. And I also have a comment on the snippets RFC that explains why I think this is a more directed solution to picking different paths through, and no one's responded to that. It's about 12 days old, and I really like to get, because it's my core concern, is that in snippets we are encapsulating, we're using snippets to encapsulate decision trees or conditionals, not to encapsulate purpose, which is what it was originally written for. And I would love to see an answer to that too, just if anyone wants to know what my thinking is around that. But I'm happy to work through it. I'd love to work through it. You know, I hear the UX concerns. I'm like, well, I started from the perspective of UX concerns. That's how I came up with multipath. Like, I tried all of the things I could think of, and I include finding out that 2 of the RFCs that are out there make a lot of sense to me for certain reasons, because I tried nesting and I tried using options to select different templates, right? It was already something I sort of in parallel came up with while I was trying a user experience. So that's why, you know, for me, it's constantly a surprise, because it's like, that's definitely the approach I took. So I'd like to know what the struggle is, because there may be something we can suggest, or I can point out, yeah, I can see how this has that problem, but this does. So if we can't find an even more ultimate solution, right? Those kinds of boundaries on this, constraints on the design.
I feel like we've talked through, you know, the kind of complexity in multipath in a couple of these, but like happy to dig more into it for sure. Like for one, I think it's going to be hard to build an interface to visualize, right? Like to the creation of a multipath supply chain in a way that's obvious to the user, right? Where instead of having to design a graph that's many graphs overlaid on top of each other, right, with conditionals that are driven by the inputs of other conditionals further down, right? I think that interface, while it might be possible to create it, it's going to be a complex interface to build.
Yeah, I really recommend you have a look at that comment I made, because that's exactly the thing I think is missed there.
Do you want to share that comment?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
I think this is the form, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It was on the...
Maybe do you want to share screen instead of David, if that's okay?
Yeah.
In RFC, sure.
I was just waiting for it to pop up. Discussions. Oh, geez. This is how I know to find it. Okay, so we're currently assessing snippets as the singular solution for multipathing. And it's not called out in the RFC. So I have a separate issue with that. I'd like to approve snippets for what it was designed for, but not for multipathing, because it's not actually mentioned in there that that's what it's being assessed for at the moment. But speaking to the criteria of multipathing, yeah, the top level supply chain and most of the sub supply chains become supply chains with 2 or 3 resources, the first of which is somewhat nebulous. It's a big box of all of the things that led up to the decision you're about to accept in the top level supply chain. So when you choose to accept a different path for pre-created images in this scenario here at the configurer, then you have a big box inside of which is one box or the other box, and then adding a choice to test or not, you end up with boxes in boxes leading up to the configurer. So we can see that in the examples that Josh created, there are top level supply chains with exactly 2 nodes. And one of them is do all of the things, and the second one is do the last thing, which my argument is encapsulation for conditionals and not encapsulation for task. And in fact, I think that with snippets and the multipath solution together, then we get encapsulation for task out of snippets. Snippets now do what they were originally proposing, which is the ability to say, you know, I've got a build step and I need to do some complex stuff within that. And it takes as many inputs as it wants, and it gives us an output, which is a great thing that it does, ability to hand that off or maybe encapsulate a more complex thing elsewhere. But the more complex thing that we're encapsulating in trying to use it for multipathing is all of the steps up to a choice. And that's just naturally, that's what happens. It starts to look like Lisp. It really does. One bunch of brackets up one end, and you know, that's my argument. I'm not sure why that's actually easier in terms of UX. I've drawn a myriad graphs of the same experience. I don't know if I need to share those at this point. I give other
Might be
people a
good
chance
to see the
comment.
vision. This visualization was actually really helpful for me, like
Okay.
convincing me why multipath was easier from the UI perspective as well. I don't know if everyone's seen it though. If everyone's seen it, then
I'll make sure.
No, I
that
haven't seen it. This is good.
I'll make sure that I share it out again. I don't know where the center of the. Does anyone know how to? Oh, there we go. How to jump to. Yeah. Let me just paste this in here. This is public, I believe. If not, if anyone has any trouble, let me know. Or just ask for permission and I'll grant it. Right, so I mean, this was my original attempt at this, and that included nested solutions. This is when I did the hack day. And then talking about like a GUI or any kind of like visualization of these paths, I started with what we have today from RFC 9, which includes options. So dotted lines is a resource, hard boxes are the templates. So one of these 2 templates would be selected in the GitOps solution. And that's already supported in RFC 9. And then I imagine someone saying, well, I need to be able to add a, this is still supported today. I need to be able to get source from one of 2 different places. I click add option. I get another option where I can put in a different template to locate a source. All right. And then I'm thinking to myself, now I want to be able to, I forget what we're implementing here. Oh, provide an image instead of some kind of source. So I add a resource and I then draw an edge from configure to that resource, because the resource I'm adding is an image provider and I know that it goes straight to my configure. So that to me is a fairly simple mutation of an existing supply chain. And I like, as Ciro says, when building from scratch, it's also fairly straightforward to use multipath to build up a supply chain, because you're doing it in one place, right? I'm sure as it gets more complex, there are reasons to abstract things away, but this is the experience that I see, which is to do the same step with snippets, you have to decide to put this whole lot. I'll just take this away for a second. You had these already. You want to add this. So you got to create a box for them, or at least you've got to create a resource for them. This becomes a template you use top level. And then all of this stuff has to be pushed down into a supply chain, which is your little black box of your image from source object. I should make sure the label emerges over the top, because now that's one of the options you've got in here. And I guess really technically, that's a solid box. Sorry, just trying to remember my key. So this is an option, image from source or image from image repo. So you've now had to collapse this into an object and push that object down somewhere to move forward with adding this one extra option. So I'm not sure from a UX, like from a graphical user interface, how wonderful that would be. It's not terrible in YAML. You create a sub supply chain, you maybe put it in another document, or you just use like multi-doc YAML, push it down, create that sub resource, make sure you get your outputs right. But it's actually, I think, a little bit more restrictive of a flow.
I think when you describe complexity in this case, right, you look at multipath compared to this nested model, right, you're viewing, fewer objects, right, less repetition of YAML, right, and representing the connections between the components in as concise a way possible, right, as reducing complexity. But I think I worry about a different kind of complexity that's, given the functionality that multipath introduces, right? In a simple example, I think it's fairly easy to understand the supply chain that'll get stamped out in the end, right? The concrete resources that'll get created. But because it's a very kind of powerful tool, right? You can imagine a less simple example being a supply chain that has many conditionals distributed throughout the supply chain, interconnected with each other, that have downstream effects, right? That make it very hard for, in that case of one YAML document, right, to understand, what the supply chain that gets stamped out for a particular workload is going to look like, right? Whereas in the snippets case, I agree. There's more repetition. There's more indirection, right? In many ways, for the simple case, it could look significantly worse, right? It's easier to understand in terms of the building blocks, right? It forces you to, when you want to introduce a more complex workflow, right, you're forced to introduce encapsulation and pay the cost, right, of organizing that more complex workflow early on, right? And to me, that feels sort of safer, longer term. And it, I think at the stage the project's in right now, which is like we've just launched, this kind of new way of constructing, a supply chain for building applications. We have users who are just trying it out early on, right? Introducing that very powerful, and potentially, like difficult to reason through in more complex cases future, it kind of feels like it's risky in a way that snippets are not. The other thing I would say is, in this example, I think you could model the inner supply chain by pushing encapsulation into a supply chain that's most of the other supply chain. But you could also, now that we're going to have field selectors at the top of supply chains, just have two supply chains: pre-built image supply chain, not pre-built image supply chain. And you wouldn't have to mark the workloads as being for one or the other, because we have field selectors that'll select the correct supply chain in the first place. And to me, that having multiple top level supply chains in that case, right, removes a lot of the indirection there and makes it clear this is one path, this is another path, and then maybe, yes, there is a way to push complexity into an encapsulated component that's reusable to accomplish the more inner switch, right, between the different kinds of providers. I'm also interested, I know Scott and James, you probably have a lot of thoughts about this too.
I mean, from my point of view, I think kind of mine, as I mentioned before, mine lends to more around that visual, and in usability side of things. Adding more complexity into maintaining and building up these, and not being able to reason about by looking at them, looking at the YAML, adds more difficulty. And I get concerned around that. A lot of successful projects that are around, that people that probably be doing these kind of things in more pipeliney worlds probably have a DSL that help them to kind of have that, that user experience, that user at that level they interact with. What we're effectively doing now is we're programming in YAML the supply chain. It's hard to internalize. And my feeling is, but be right from the start, the easier we can make it, the less complex we can make it to start with. We're going to get more people being able to use it and feeding in, and we'll find better UX around to be able to provide going forward. If we do too much now, it might add too much complexity and put people off. That's where I see these kind of things, smaller things to enable us to build out a runway for the features that we need to support, but gathering more feedback and certainly around the UX around these things.
I think that a second dimension that hasn't really been talked about is like the secondary benefits that encapsulation gives us from snippets. And once we start to have multiple runtimes, other than just like deploying to Knative or, you know, whatever else you want it to be. Like if you wanted to say, oh, I want to create a deployment instead of Knative, or if I want to have a job or a task or a stream processor or whatever the runtime happens to be, like the encapsulation of like image from source becomes reusable across all those other supply chains without having to have the same multi-pathing paths redefined in every single one of those supply chains. So like, I agree that's like, it's a little bit more complex up front. I do think overall that the model is simpler and also gives more structure to handle the more complex cases with clarity. Like I still haven't seen a case where we have like a more complex supply chain with the multi-pathing example to kind of see like where it falls apart. It's pure just like gut feel that like
the
it
most
might get more complicated as we go.
The most complex that I've seen, and that's the best I've been able to work on, this is maybe where someone like Scott would be able to help us. The most complex that I've been exposed to is encapsulated here, right? Which is different kinds of GitOps behavior, different source provision fields, and a different image provider, right? I'd love to see something more complex so that we could work it through. The risk that I perceive, I think, is actually in more complex situations, because where you said encapsulation, this one here, it's fortunate that like source provider through to image builder is a good encapsulation. But if image builder through to configure was a good encapsulation, you might run into problems because it's much harder to encapsulate for purpose halfway through a supply chain at the moment without some other way of doing selection. Because I don't know if I've said it before, but multipath would do really well for the ability to create encapsulation for purpose in snippets. No denying that snippets would be useful. Just I think that multipath then makes it possible to encapsulate what you want to encapsulate in snippets rather than encapsulate this is a point that leads into a choice. I created this because it leads into a choice. This is not because I really needed image from source as a doer, all right, as a job. What I needed was a way to lead into a choice between image from source and image from repo. So it was chosen for conditionals, not chosen for task. And they tend to lead this way. They tend to collapse in this way. That's been your experience, right, Josh? I think that's because Josh is the one who wrote up a lot of those examples for snippets.
To be honest, I have not felt the pain, right? Because I've just been copying and pasting examples that you've done and that Washuma's done. So I have not felt the pain in either snippets or multipath.
I wasn't really talking about pain, just that the shape of it. I think Washuma also said that originally when he tried it, was that you end up with your encapsulation going further down as you go towards the left, because you're then leading into solution choices. Those choices have to have a block on the left. They have to have something encapsulated on the left of them. All right. It's for the choice you're making, not for the task that you want to replace or reuse.
Yeah, for me, the weirdest thing about the snippets example is literally the fact that like we always tell the story of, oh, it's going from source to something that gets pushed somewhere, right? Like source, quote unquote, to production. But then if you're looking at the high level box there, you see image configure GitOps. So you don't see that, oh, there is a choice that's been taken on whether you use a source or not. While with an approach that has both multipath and snippets, you could be presenting at that like very high level that, oh, there is a choice being made in taking or not source code based on the image being set or not in the workload. And we could like encapsulate that image step as like a snippet, right? But you would still be able to see at the very high level that, oh, source might or might not be included depending on the workload specifying like image or source. So that thing of, yeah, you end up branching with encapsulation, yeah, you end up hiding some of those details. While with multipath combined with snippets, we can have, yeah, in my opinion, the best of both worlds.
Kind of sounds like we're hearing with multipath, the complex case becomes really difficult to understand and follow and understand the ramifications of. But with snippets, even the simple case becomes impossible to reason about from the supply chain itself. I mean, the top level supply chain becomes essentially meaningless in terms of understanding the flow. Whereas in multipath, the complex supply chain is what becomes essentially meaningless because it's too hard to read. And that kind of feels like what's being said here. I don't know, unless I'm misrepresenting that.
And in both cases, I'm heavily dedicated to helping us generate a nice visual editor or visualizer that makes it easy to pick up all of the stuff you're building and visualize. I think you need it in both cases. I think you need it in supply chain when you're trying to understand what's being produced.
On the topic of snippets being hard in the simple case, right? Is snippets hard in the simple case when you attempt to construct a single supply chain that accounts for, you know, very heavy variation, right, in the earlier parts? You know, is that a like, maybe that's just an unrealistic way of kind of using that feature as opposed to creating two different supply chains? Because for me, creating two different supply chains that maybe has a little bit of repetition right at the end, for example, might be, given that we already have reusability through the templates themselves, right? That might be easier to think about than a simple multi-path case that has conditions embedded in the supply chain, right? Because you can look at one example that's very concrete and you know what it does, or you can look at another example that's very concrete and you know what it does. And the reusable components are simple, small pieces of that where you can actually share them between the two, right? And in other contexts, and understand, you know, what that kind of, you know, the optional supply chain component that you plugged in looks like in the case of either of them.
Then
like,
not be true with a complex multipath case. Like you could reduce that complexity by having multiple supply chains and not get yourself into such a complex supply chain.
Well, on top of that, I mean, in the complex multipath supply chain, you can also then say all of these really obvious things that I always want to have it in a snippet. You could add a snippet, and when you want that reuse to jump across two supply chains, though I feel like my experience has been with people not liking that there are 5 different web supply chains in their stack because they have to. They'd much rather just have the one, understand it and deliver it. And I think there's certain bits you want to understand in encapsulation. So that's why snippets is so awesome.
but at the point where you're talking about one supply chain that's doing something drastically different, right? It's no longer building an image, you know, where the common components are pretty small between the two, right? Does it make sense to try to smush them together so you can just have one, right?
Might not, no.
It seems like we agree snippets is a useful tool, right? And that it can also solve this problem, even if we don't agree that the interface, you know, or if we disagree about where we want to see complexity arise, if that makes sense. We agree snippets is a useful tool and then it can solve the problem. So I feel like moving forward with that one, right, quickly, is helpful no matter what, right? And then it doesn't feel like there's a lot of pressure to come up with a, interface for multipath and ship that soon compared to snippets. I think like part of my perspective is like looking at how users are using Cartographer right now. I talked to, I can't share a lot about this use case, but I talked to a team that was trying to build Kubernetes using Cartographer last week. And the places where they needed, conditionals and they needed to introduce more complexity to handle their use case were actually very different than the places that we're thinking about right now. So they have a supply chain that actually stamps out more workloads that then get picked up by other supply chains that then kind of fan out and then fan back in again at the end. To, like the ways they're using Cartographer in a realistic scenario, right, to build a real application, the places where they determined they needed more complexity wouldn't be served well by multipath, right? And so I'm worried about, because we don't have a lot of feedback, and multipath is a very powerful tool that could let a user introduce a lot of complexity, that being safe, right, doing the simple thing that we generally agree should happen, and then getting more feedback before we deliver the more complex feature on top of it, it kind of seems like it's maybe will give us a better longer term outcome. It's not that I feel like multipath is like I do feel like snip multipath is a very elegant solution to solving this problem, and especially in simple cases, right? That it only adds a minimal amount of syntax to what we have to be able to to add a lot of power, right? I just worry about that larger problem for someone who's not used to Cartographer and how they're going to apply that feature and whether it's useful to them or whether it will create more problems for them in the long term. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm just going to leave my part of this here. The only concern I have about just snippets is that I don't think people can produce the abstractions that will improve their ability to deal with scenarios like you're talking about, because they end up creating abstractions for conditionals versus abstractions for purpose. And if that doesn't prove to be true, that's great, but that's the risk I'm trying to avoid. That's why after trying snippets, trying nesting, I thought there must be some way that I can make these abstractions for a good reason, like these abstractions for purpose.
I wonder if we can try snippets with our users and get them to complain about those pain points. And so we know how to prioritize where we add more complexity in the future, as opposed to trying to preempt that and deliver, this very rich, more complex, DSL of multiple features early on, and then, have a bunch of users that are using those more complex features and have to support them moving forward, right?
Yeah, I just think this is a bit where I have to agree to disagree, because I also don't see the more complexity. I think this is an extension of options to accept inputs as one of the criteria. I don't see it as being very complex at all. No new CRDs, and no difference from the amount of complexity in the final supply chain. It'll have the same number of objects.
Those conditionals cascade though, right? Like conditionals on one drive the inputs of something else, and if something else is pointing at that, to drive the inputs of something else, right? And
as do snippets, yeah. And if you want to do something that's in one snippet elsewhere in the supply chain, you have to mention it 2 places, and that becomes brittle.
But where snippets, when you add that complexity, right? When you add that optionality with snippets, you're forced to encapsulate it into something that you can more easily understand at the high level, or in multipath you're not. But we've decided that we need snippets regardless, right? That we think it's a good feature regardless. And so, to some extent, I'm just saying, can we slow down on that one, part of the UX?
Sure.
Right, folks. Thank you. Sorry, Rash. I will stop here.
Just one last note on this. I know we're over time. Can someone from the Technical Oversight Committee encapsulate these comments on the RFC so that we have this documented?
Yeah, I was about to mention that. Just a friendly reminder from the RFC process itself. The idea is to discuss as much as possible in the PR directly. And if there is any outside discussion, it will be good idea to summarize it in the thread, not only for the maintainers team, but especially for folks out there outside the core team, for them to have the context and be able to provide feedback. So we will ask for that, please. So it looked like for these two ones, we are not in a position to make a decision yet. But yeah, please provide your log your comments there in the RFCs, please. All right.
Sorry, just 1 second. The snippets one is still in draft. Is somebody kind of still actively working on pushing that one forward?
I think the author expressed that he preferred multipath, and so at least for that time being. So I don't know that anyone's pushing it forward, and there hasn't been a spec that's been agreed upon. So I don't know where we're at in that one.
It also needs its motivation change so that it's aligned realistically with what we're doing. Because what its motivation is harder to achieve without multipath.
Does someone from the Technical Oversight Committee want to take ownership of the RFC?
Of which one now, sorry?
For snippets.
RFC
Yes.
005.
When you say take the ownership, what do you mean by that?
Push it forward. Like Marty said, there is no spec. I'm not sure that there's enough team buy-in for anyone on this team to have the motivation, right? And so once we have something there and we can see it, I just think that would push it through faster.
Yeah, no, I definitely see there's still lots of conflicts around all of this. So yeah, makes sense. But yeah, I'll take that on. Okay.
Thanks, James.
I've got to drop now anyway, so I'll catch up with you through the week, folks.
Thanks, James.
Great. Okay. Conventions. I guess it's Scott.
Yeah, so this is less a discussion topic unless people want to talk about it, more an announcement that got approval to create a repo called VMware Tanzu Cartographer-Conventions, and more or less dumped the code into that repo, slightly modified from what we had internally. So it's available for people to look at. So they can start having conversations about code rather than just sort of hypothetical things. It's still by no means complete. Doesn't presume the approval and acceptance of this RFC. It's just sort of furthering the conversation.
Can you paste the, oh, I think Sarah just did, never mind.
I'd really like a hour with you with the team to do I know your first introduction to us. And then probably separate, more pointed discussions. I think we'll learn a lot from it as well. So would like something like that set up maybe after our current 030 deadlines. Would be really nice.
Yeah, we can do something like that. I don't know if we want to take this call at some point in the future and dedicate it towards that purpose or schedule something separately.
Certainly wouldn't hurt to have it in the public domain either way.
Oh, one thing I wanted to bring up. So we do have the Cartographer their site repo as well. So whenever we, like, if we want to somehow do a merge of documentation or even start thinking about it, we totally can. It's not public because like nobody had time to work in that repo yet. But whenever we want to start that work, we totally can. Got every like approval needed for that.
I'm personally very keen to rip the docs, rip the site out and pop it in there. because I do a lot of active updates in there, so it'd be nice to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. It will be really helpful. All right, so yeah, thank you, Scott, for sharing the good news. So it means that we should move this RFC to a different stage. I don't know which one.
No, I think we should review that RFC alongside
Okay.
the public repo, and we should
Alright.
maybe try and get it to the point that we actually put some acceptance on there.
This one got accepted already, right? This is the one that,
Convention service?
yeah, we accepted this already.
Oh, did we?
It predated our, yeah,
No, this is it
it
here.
predated our process. It
Oh,
predated the new RFC process, but we agreed we accepted this like weeks and weeks ago.
oh, that's
So
great.
I
Because
think
I was
we just
looking
need
at
to
it going,
accept
oh, I'm surprised that we decided to hold out on it. So I thought we must have been waiting for Scott's source code.
That's certainly news to me. I mean, I'm fine going through the new RFC process for this, just otherwise. I don't think there's any reason why it needs to be special.
Okay, so you want it to go through the new process, so it's not accepted yet?
Well, I mean, I don't know what it means to be accepted, considering it's still an open PR. But like, I'm fine treating it with the new approved RFC process to actually get it to be formally accepted and merged.
Okay.
Right, so we need to have some reviews and approvals in order to meet the new RFC process. All right, anything else regarding conventions? If not, there's this is new to me, a request for RFC.
Yeah. This is part of our RFC process. We haven't really used it much before, but it's an open request for an RFC around a certain area of interest. And so I've started our first request for RFC that will allow resources to report a status, one that we can capture in the workload status as well. So it would be about the workload status being more helpful, so it can indicate, the state of some of your resources under the hood. And in the past, we have touched on this subject a whole bunch, but it's usually with some other end goal in mind of like, doing some blocking or like, doing something else. And so the purpose of this RFC is really just to collect this information for the purposes of surfacing it to end users.
So how should we proceed with a request for RFC? Someone would on it and actually write an RFC, or how does it work?
So it can stay open if someone, I mean, in general, right? If it's not something that the maintainers team can get to right now, then we'll open a request for RFC. And, if someone from the community has a vested interest in working on it, then they can start looking at it. If not, it'll eventually get prioritized as part of the maintainers team, and then we'll start working on it. So.
Yeah, it's not in our current roadmap, right? But sorry, in the immediate sprint, if you like. I don't know what we're calling our most immediate concerns, but when it does, we'd definitely pick it up. I would take a swing for sure. It's just a matter of priorities.
Yeah, it's not going to make the 0.30 release, but after that, we'll start looking at it.
Okay, so looks like that's it. Anything else you'd like to discuss? Sure. No. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. See you next week.